Thank you so much, and I would like to start from saying thank you to the organizers of the program and as well as organizers of the workshop for this wonderful opportunity to spend some time here as well as to present our results today. So the work that I will present was done by graduate and undergraduate students in my group and postdocs, whom you can see in here. In particular, Bogdan, Mike, Julian, and Paul contributed a lot to what I will present today, and as well as Chinkun Liu, who is not here right now on the picture. We collaborated with a number of research groups around the globe, mostly theoretical scientists of Tasinkevich from Stuttgart in Germany, Tom and Randy from Penn, Rob Kursner from UMass, and Miha as well as Slobodan from Ljubljana. And on experimental side, we got some materials from Patrick Keller in France. So in my talk today, I will start from motivation and will then present different types of topologically distinct particles that can be introduced into liquid crystals. I'll then proceed with particles that can morph their shape, and we can do it actively using laser beams. Toward the end, I'll set an ambitious set of goals, which will include morphing and changing topology of colloidal particles. In future, it will be great to see how one can probe dynamics of generation of topological defects in liquid crystals, as we would change topology of colloidal particles while it's introduced inside of liquid crystal medium. And so I would like to start from well-known fact that one of the early models of atoms was proposed by Lord Kelvin, and he thought that atoms are nothing else but knotted vortices. Nowadays we of course know that atoms are something different, but the elementary particles, which at the time of Kelvin were thought to be atoms, actually could be knots. And so in particular, there are many theories predicting that elementary particles are different kinds of knots. And for example, in here you can see one article talking about the structure of glue balls. And some of those particles have been discovered, while other ones have not been even discovered so far, like for example, glue balls in particular. Having tiny size on the order of femtometers, obviously it would be impossible to see details of structures corresponding to those knots, but perhaps we can use liquid crystals as a medium to model such structures. And on the other end of spectrum, in terms of dimensions, cosmic strings can also be noted, and obviously there are also many challenges in terms of observations corresponding to those cosmic strings. But liquid crystals and topological liquid crystal colloids perhaps could allow us to have a topological toolkit that would allow us to explore a lot of problems related to other fields of science, not only just liquid crystals and soft condensed matter physics. And so for this audience, I'm sure it's familiar already the basics of spherical colloidal particles inside of liquid crystal medium. And yesterday we had a couple nice introductions to this problem. So if you have a spherical particle and you treat it for vertical or perpendicular boundary conditions, as depicted in here, you realize quickly that the structure of director field around it resembles that around topological defect. And so if you introduce those particles into a liquid crystal medium, then inevitably you need to generate topological defects that will compensate for the topological charge of those particles. And so in here you can see two examples of what type of defects can be induced in a uniformly aligned liquid crystal, point defects and ring-shaped disclination loops that have been observed and explored in some details in the past. Now, we can generate many other shapes of particles, not only just use spherical colloids, but one can, for example, use photolithography and generate many different other shapes of colloidal particles. So in here you can see experimental procedure of fabrication of non-spherical colloids that we used some time ago, and you can see it involves the position of all kinds of different layers, photolithography, direct laser writing, use of different types of solvents, and after many different steps that depicted in here, as well as washing of particles and treatment of surfaces of particles, we can eventually introduce those colloids into liquid crystal mediums and obtain a liquid crystalline dispersion of non-spherical particles. So what kinds of shapes we can generate using this photolithography approach? Well, for example, we can obtain colloidal spirals, right? And so in here you can see spiral-shaped particles, two-dimensional in this case, that are introduced into a uniformly aligned liquid crystal. The far-field director is perpendicular to the screen, and by probing the director structure induced by those colloids, we can see by means of regular polarizing microscopy as well as nonlinear optical imaging by means of multiphoton fluorescence, we can deduce the structure of director field around this particle. And so this structure can also then be obtained by means of numerical modeling. And so what we see is that this particle, aligned with its plane perpendicular to the far-field director, has a disclination loop following the shape of the particle as depicted in here, right? And so now if you look at the structure of the defect around spherical particle and this highly complex non-spherical particle, you can see that you could obtain both colloid and the defect around it by morphing them, right? So you could morph this spherical particle to a spiral, and then as you would do it, the ring-shaped defect would morph as well to the spiral-shaped defect structure in here. And so we can complicate the geometry of colloids a lot, going, for example, to double spirals, triple spirals, as you can see in here. We can also, instead of those type of two-dimensional particles, fabricate three-dimensional particles like those pyramids you can see in here. But there is a lot in common in terms of those particles. In fact, they are all indistinguishable from each other from the standpoint of view of topology, right? So you could morph those particles all to spheres without having to do cuts or gluing of them together, right? And so one of the goals we had recently was to fabricate particles that would be actually topologically distinct from spheres and topologically distinct from each other. And so you can see in here a number of different shapes. Some of them are isomorphic to spheres, right? So all of the ones I showed you so far would be isomorphic to spheres. Now the other ones, like those handle bodies in here, are not, and they are therefore quite interesting from the standpoint of view of being used as colloids in liquid crystals, and we will call them topological colloids because topologically they are distinct from spheres. So let us see what happens if we introduced a colloidal particle that has 5 holes. That means the genus of this particle is 5 into a liquid crystal. You can see a number of different defects that are observed, you can see in those polarizing microscopy textures. Now we can do three-dimensional nonlinear optical imaging by means of multi-photon fluorescence. So the different colors in here depict the fluorescent signals that we are getting by using different polarizations of excitation femtosecond light, which is horizontal or vertical in this case. And we can also obtain vertical cross-sections of all of those images to see what is the director structure around colloidal particles. So from those type of images, we can then reconstruct the details of director fields. Now you can see already from those images and from those cartoons I show in here that we induce topological defects. The magenta and red colors in here depict the defects of opposite signs, right? So pluses and minuses. Now, different defects obviously appear depending on the number of holes or genus of those colloidal particles. And what's interesting is that we can use external fields of different kinds, laser beams, or, for example, apply an electric field and rotate those particles or switch between different multi-stable orientations. Like, for example, in here you can see one stable orientation where particle ring is perpendicular to far-field director, and in this case it's parallel to far-field director at no applied field at all to the liquid crystal cell, right? And we can switch between those two different states just by using different voltage driving schemes. We can go back and forth. Now, as we do it, obviously the structure of defects changes a lot, right? So now the defects you observe in here are different types of loops and point defects than what we saw before. Although they are topologically similar, but the structure, details of the structure of director field is different, right? And so moreover, we can, as I already mentioned, continuously rotate those particles, right, as we apply voltage, and we can see from those cross-sections the particles will tilt, and we can do a lot of different types of structural transformations, but topology remains constrained, right? And so here, for example, I show what happens when the particles of different genus are aligned with their ring planes parallel to far-field director, and you can see the types of point defects that are being induced in this case. Now, if for all different particles of different genus we count the hedgehog topological charge corresponding to those point defects, we discover a relation that's very well known for mathematicians, right? So what we find is that the total charge, if you add all the pluses and minuses of defects that you induce in the texture, is equal to chi over 2, where chi is Euler characteristic and can be calculated using this simple expression, where G is the genus of the colloidal particle, right? And so this is nothing else but prediction of topological theorems, because those theorems define what would be the charge or degree in mathematical language corresponding to the vector field perpendicular to the surface of colloidal particle, and as you would change genus of those colloidal particles. And so now as we introduce those colloidal particles into liquid crystal medium, we have to compensate for those charges, just like in the case of spherical colloidal particles. And so therefore, we induce the topological defects of charge opposite to that of the particle in terms of sign, but equal in magnitude. Now, let's see what will happen if instead of particles with perpendicular boundary conditions, we will use colloids with tangential surface anchoring. Also, one structure you can observe is when the ring-shaped colloidal particle in here is perpendicular with its plane to the far-field director, as depicted in here, and we don't observe any defects at all, right? So here is three-dimensional imaging, both in plane of the particle and perpendicular to it. We can do also numerical modeling and by minimizing Landau-Desjardins free energy, and obtain the details of director field that is depicted in here around this ring-shaped toroidal colloidal particle, both in plane of the particle ring and perpendicular to it. And so as you can notice from this structure is that you just have twisting and untwisting of director field that's done in this axially symmetric manner, and there are no defects at all. So the director field is simply deformed to satisfy the boundary conditions.
Is the nematic chiral? Or
no, it's nematic, just no chiral dopant.
And what's the mechanism that generates this?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, what the nematic chiral or non-chiral? So the answer is it's non-chiral, and the mechanism that generates this twist in here is to meet the boundary conditions, you produce a distortion that's defect-free. And so you have twisting on one side, untwisting on the other side. There is certain energetic cost corresponding to this type of deformation. We will see it's higher than that of structure with topological defects, but this is also a stable or metastable state as well, right?
Do you need to start displaying the energy to
You do not have to obtain it in numerical modeling, but that could additionally stabilize, right? Yeah. All right, so now as you can see in here, for the same type of colloidal particle, we can also observe bosoms. And so it's the same type of ring, right, which we can simply introduce into a nematic liquid crystal with planar alignment. And then you can see we can observe 4 different bosoms in here that are clearly seen from this optical microscopy texture because of scattering from the bosoms themselves, right? Now we can reconstruct director field structure that is depicted in here, and what we see is that there are bosoms of different charge, right? So we can characterize bosoms in many different ways. One is in terms of two-dimensional director field that we have at the interface of colloidal particle and liquid crystal. And so in terms of that two-dimensional field, we can introduce strengths of two-dimensional defects, right? Just like Gareth did yesterday. And so we will see that there are defects in this two-dimensional field of both plus and minus strengths, one and plus and minus 1.
Sorry, can I ask a topologically ignorant question? Is there a reason you couldn't have a plus or minus 1/2?
It's a good question, and I will give you an answer, very pictorial one, okay? And so in just a couple of minutes, yeah? It will be in a couple slides. So I'll not repeat your question because I'll answer it anyway. All right, so you can see that those both structures are possible, right? And the one which has defects, the bosoms, 4 different bosoms, surprisingly is actually more frequently observable, so it might be more stable. And that actually is in agreement with numerical calculation of the free energies corresponding to those 2 structures, right? So you can see in here the dependence of that free energy as a function of angle between the ring plane and far field director. And so you can see that the defect-free structure is of lower energy when they are perpendicular to each other, indeed, as we saw in here, right? But the global minimum is still the state with 4-point defects that you can see in here. And so, well, it might look a little bit surprising because we introduced 4 defects, but we have lower energy state, right? However, if you think about all the distortions that those particles induce in those 2 different structures, that actually does make sense. So the defects, the bosoms, allow you to relieve some of the elastic distortions that you induce in this sample. So now let us proceed with a little bit more complicated topologies of those particles. So if you go to genus 2 colloidal particles, we again can see more than just one structure, right? There are many stable or metastable or bistable or multistable structures that we can observe with different positions of bosoms on the surface of those colloidal particles. And in here, I just depict one that's observed both in experiments and in numerical modeling. And we obtain all of them as metastable or stable states in numerical modeling and in experiments as well. Again, just as before, we can characterize the two-dimensional director field, and for all particles of different genus, and we probed particles ranging with genus ranging from 1 to 5, we see that this topological constraint is satisfied, right? So the strengths of all two-dimensional defects in the two-dimensional director field at the interface of particle and liquid crystal are equal to chi, at to chi, right? So now you can see, for example, how this works for particles of different genus, like 3 and 4 and 5. You can see again that there are many metastable or multistable states, but they all follow topological predictions of what the strengths, total strengths of defects should be. Now, we can also characterize three-dimensional charge corresponding to those defects, and we can define this boson characteristic as well as boson bulk charge, which is relatively easy to be defined for the case when we have tangential surface boundary conditions in this form. And indeed, not only we satisfy this condition for the two-dimensional topological defects, but also the bulk defects, which would be equivalent to bulk defects that we saw before being induced by particles with perpendicular boundary conditions, also adds to chi over 2 for the same reasons as before, right? Because those particles induce defects that can be characterized by certain charge, topological charge that is then compensated in the liquid crystal medium. Now, the question that we had from John is interestingly answered in here, right? So what's interesting is that the point defects, the bosoms, can also split into semi-loops, disclination semi-loops that you can see in here. And if you were now to look at the director structure in the interface of liquid crystal and colloidal particle, you would see that we have half-integer disclinations in here, right? And so indeed we can have that splitting, but this happens very locally, right? So this is internal structure of those bosoms, and it's very similar to what was observed before for point defects in the bulk of liquid crystal, as well as for bosoms on spherical colloidal particles in previous works. But what's interesting in this particular case is that we use handle body shaped particles to induce handles in the surfaces, the tubes that Slobodan was describing yesterday, that characterize reduced surfaces with reduced order parameter, right? So now those are essentially additional handles that are induced by those handle body shaped colloids. Yes?
In bulk, if you have a +1 disclination line, it's energetically favorable for that to split into two 1/2 and for that to separate to infinity. Evidently, that's not true for the boson. Is there an easy way to understand that?
Well, it's because if you would do that, you would induce a lot more distortions. But locally, that's still favorable, right? So if you would propagate that to infinity, that would be more distortions. To me, that's an easy way to understand it.
What's a +1 disclination line? What do you mean?
Is this a question to me? Well, so maybe you guys should talk later.
Very good. You're sharing yourself very well.
All right, but so far I discussed with you mostly two-dimensional shapes, right? So the question is, can we also generate topologically interesting three-dimensional shapes? And the answer is yes, we can use multi-photon polymerization technique that would allow us to fabricate colloids with three-dimensional shape. In this paper here, we use this technique to fabricate colloids that are still topologically trivial, morphable to spheres, right? But I'll show you, demonstrate examples of more interesting colloidal particles. So the way this technique works is we use femtosecond laser light and multi-photon absorption processes in order to induce photopolymerization locally, right? So we take then liquid crystal polymer that has photoinitiator, and that's essentially a dye that can absorb light by means of two-photon absorption process. Therefore, because it's a highly nonlinear process, we can have that absorption happening very locally when we tightly focus laser light, and by simply drawing the different structures, moving that focus within the sample, we can polymerize particles of virtually any shapes you want, right? So there are no restrictions known to us at this point. So for example, we can fabricate colloidal knots that you can see depicted in here, trefoil, pentafoil colloidal knots. Those are details of the structures under different views of scanning electron microscopy. You can see that we can generate those structures in the range from couple micrometers to 10 micrometers or so overall size with sub-micrometer cross-sections. And what that means is those are really colloidal particles that now can be probed as we introduce them into liquid crystal medium. So here you can see a trifoil colloidal knot with tangential surface boundary conditions as it's introduced into a liquid crystal medium with well-defined far-field liquid crystal director. And so you can observe already point defects on the surface of this particle because this particle has tangential boundary conditions. Now, to understand the details of the structure corresponding to it, we can do three-dimensional multi-photon fluorescence imaging of the director distortions around this colloidal particle where director deviates from far-field alignment most significantly. And then we can, so that's such an image in here. And then we can look at details of the director structure in each particular plane of interest corresponding to such a colloid. So for example, if we look at this plane, the blue plane depicted in here, we can then take a look at what happens with the director field as we probe it by means of excitation with different polarizations of light depicted by those green and red bars in here. And so that can be compared to predictions of numerical modeling that was done by Micha and Slobodan. And so based on their director field structure, we can then simulate the multi-photon fluorescence microscopy texture, and we can see very good agreement, right? So now we can also use the technique which was introduced yesterday by Gareth Alexander to visualize the director structure and defects that we have in this configuration of colloidal particle with director distortions around it. And you can see the bosoms that have been induced by this colloidal particle with surface boundary conditions being tangential. Now, if we switch these surface boundary conditions to perpendicular by using a different treatment, we now can see a different structure, which is also predicted by means of numerical modeling. And essentially what we have, as you can see from this cartoon, is a pair of half-integer disclination lines following the structure of the trifoil colloidal knot. Those are nothing else but -1/2 disclination lines that are also knotted, right? And so in terms of what structures we observe for the two different types of boundary conditions on the surface of particle, you can see that for the case of tangential boundary conditions, we see bosoms, while for perpendicular boundary conditions, we see knotted disclination loops that appear in those structures. And there are, in fact, just like in the case of handle body-shaped particles, many metastable states that would correspond to different orientations of those colloidal knots with respect to far-field director. I just showed you today very basic ones. So similar kind of study can be done also for pentafoil knots, for example. So, again, by means of multi-photon fluorescence imaging, we can look at what happens with the director structure around those colloidal particles in different planes along this structure of pentafoil particle. And we can then indeed see that we again induce boujons because this particle has tangential boundary conditions. So the particles I showed you before were just undergoing Brownian motion in liquid crystal. They are just colloids of a couple micrometers in size. But the question is, can we actively control such colloids that are topologically non-trivial by means of some external fields? And so this movie in here was meant to demonstrate to you that this is indeed possible to do. In fact, one could even use the setup you can see in here, which is meant to allow for magnetic control by means of those three different coils. This type of arrangement of coils allows you for holonomic control around different angles. The movie that you can see in here was rotated by means of strong magnets inside of liquid crystal, and you can observe the director structures as they change as you apply magnetic field. The reason we can do this type of control is because we introduced magnetic nanoparticles into the photopolymerized structure of the trifoil knot that you can see depicted in here. And then those now allow us for magnetic response of those colloids. But what I demonstrated to you so far is that, yes?
Sorry, just a short question. Does the application of magnetic field influence the global Mach director?
It's a very good question. Well, because the magnetic particles are so highly responsive to magnetic field, at the fields we use in here, director is non-responsive, right? So that's the idea that we want to have response from particle alone, but not from director field. We could, of course, apply electric field more easily to electrodes and not even bother with magnetic fields. But what's cool about this type of manipulation is that the colloid is being controlled directly. And with a high precision, you can do it because magnetic fields allow to apply high torques that, for example, cannot be applied by means of optical manipulation. All right, so good. Sorry I did not repeat it, but hopefully it's clear from the answer. Now I demonstrated to you that we can fabricate those three-dimensional topologically non-trivial colloids, and we can actively manipulate them, but what remains to be seen is whether it would be actually possible to tie knots inside of liquid crystal medium, right? I think that would be cool because with that you would actually change topology of the particle by gluing it together or instead cutting colloids inside of liquid crystals. And we have seen from what I demonstrated that because there are such strong constraints on what defects are induced in liquid crystal by colloids with different topology, there should be generation or annihilation of defects corresponding to that, and that dynamics could be quite interesting to explore. So, obviously morphing shape of particles could be easy, like in this case, if you employed somebody under the age of 5 to do it for you with big particles. But the challenge is to do transformations of colloidal shapes between well-defined topologically distinct structures inside of liquid crystal medium. And so, for example, it would be great if you could go from cylinders to unknots or those rings or knots and Seyfert surfaces, and then back to spheres or something like that, and then see what happens with the liquid crystal defects as we do those transformations. That's a challenging goal. I may run out of time and not be able to show you today, but I'll show you at least that, hopefully demonstrate that this should be possible. Let us start from simply morphing the shape of particles. And for this purpose, it's actually really best to use another kind of liquid crystal. So we make those particles out of liquid crystal elastomers, and what we use is main chain liquid crystal elastomers. The chemistry you can see in this paper by Patrick Keller, from whom we obtained the materials. And I think for all of you it's known that in liquid crystal elastomers we have coupling between the shape and ordering, right? And so if you would fabricate, for example, cylindrical particles, which you can do of different sizes, 2 by 6, 10 by 50, anything in between. So then if you were to change temperature from low when you are in nematic phase to isotropic phase, the shape of those particles would change, right? So they become shorter and more fat, as depicted in here, right? So this is now in isotropic state, as you can see between cross polarizers with phase retardation plate and here, right? So we can do this fairly simple change of shape only by means of changing temperature, but a lot more can be done, as we will see, by changing ordering locally. And so in those particles that I demonstrated, we have the director field on average along the cylinder, which was obtained by means of applying strong magnetic field during the time of photopolymerization. And we can see by means of multiphoton fluorescence imaging with different polarization states, as well as Karst microscopy, that inside of this particle we have weakly undulating director field, as depicted in here. You can also notice tiny little dots. Those indicate the photoluminescence coming from tiny nanoparticles that we deliberately introduced into such a medium. Those are gold nanoparticles. The reason we infiltrated those microcolloids with gold nanospheres of 2 nanometers inside is because we want to transfer heat from laser light directly to the sample locally. And so for that purpose, it's best to use 2 nanometer gold nanoparticles, because you can see in here that for such small nanoparticles, we really maximize photoconversion, photothermal conversion as compared to larger gold nanoparticles, for example. Right? And so we use 2 nanometer gold nanospheres. Now, if we scan a laser beam along this direction in a cylinder, you can see we can morph the particle shape. And so this colloid can, for example, be bent simply by scanning the laser beam in this direction as depicted here. So why do we have this type of bending? So if we simply take a focused laser beam and introduce it into certain location in the particle, you can see that we make it locally more fat, right? So not surprisingly, we expand its lateral size locally, but if we move that laser spot within the dimension of particle, we can see that the structure relaxes back to nice cylinder, and that fat region simply moves with the position of the focused laser beam. Now, however, if we scan the laser beam along particular well-defined directions, more interesting stuff happens, right? Not just simply tiny modification of shape, but really significant transformation that you can see depicted in here. So all of those particles shapes have been obtained by morphing a cylinder, right? Simply by scanning the laser beams along those blue arrows that you can see depicted in here. And those transformations of shapes are stable for as long as you need them. However, we can also reverse and go back to uniform nice cylinders by scanning in opposite direction. right? So if we turn off the laser light discontinuously, those particle shapes are stable. However, if we slowly reduce laser power, then the particle shape will relax, right? So you can see there is interesting kinetics in terms of the response of those particles to laser beams that can be observed in here. Now, those particles are birefringent, right, because they are liquid crystalline particles, and you can, for example, transfer angular momentum, like if you have them in the laser trap in here, you can make them spin by use of circular polarized light, or you can rotate them by using linearly polarized laser beams of light as they were in this trap. So now you can see from this animation that we can do quite fast, robust modifications of the shape, and while the particle is also introduced into liquid crystal medium. So in here it's in a liquid crystal, and as we bend such a particle, we introduce distortions around the particle in the liquid crystal medium, and so with that we induce low symmetry distortions. So we can morph the particle shape. Essentially, in here is a depiction of what we can do with such initially rod-shaped particle. We can morph it into many rigidly connected cylindrical rods, as depicted in here, and we can understand how those particles align inside the liquid crystal medium by simply using the Jean-Brochard modeling of the torque induced by the elastic liquid crystal medium as we were to rotate a rod-like particle inside of liquid crystal. So by using one elastic constant approximation and electrostatic analogy, they came up with such a result in here. And we can adopt this approach, extended simply to those more complicated particles that simply cylindrical fragments rigidly connected to each other. And we can obtain equilibrium alignment of such a particle, the result for it, by simply maximizing the length of such a colloid along the liquid crystal director. Now, we can introduce those colloids also into cholesteric liquid crystal medium. So in this case, it's an emetic elastomeric colloidal particle inside of lytropic cholesteric liquid crystal medium. You can see layered structure that one can have around such a colloidal fragment of complex shaped particle, and those layers in here correspond to cholesteric half pitch, right? So now we can morph the shape of those particles inside the liquid crystal. So from initially a cylindrical rod, we can produce C and U, and notice that although the shape of those particles is somewhat resembling each other, but alignment with respect to far-field cholesteric helical axis is very different in the two cases, right? So now we induce very complicated distortions in the, not only in liquid crystal director field of cholesteric, but also in helical axis and in the layered cholesteric structure around it. And so in here you can see those helical axis fields depicted by green lines, while cholesteric layers by those bluish lines. We can both induce low symmetry structures as well, so for example, change aspect ratios, as well as induce highly low symmetry configurations of director fields. For example, in here you can see point group symmetries of director field structures that we have corresponding to those different colloids, right? So coming next is will be our attempt to really not only bend those colloidal particles, but reconnect them inside the liquid crystal medium. One can also change topology in different ways. So for example, Slobodan Žumer and Ljubljana group are looking at using numerical modeling, what would happen as you would change the size of hole inside of toroidal particles and eventually remove that hole, so change topology this way. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities in terms of exploring the topological interplay between the topologies of colloidal surfaces, director fields, and defects in liquid crystals. And I hope I was able to demonstrate to you that in future those could be used as a toolkit to explore such interplay, not only from the standpoint of view of liquid crystal science alone, but also trying to understand bigger picture problems in other fields of science as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one quick question if there is one. Yes, in your the microphone.
I can just talk loud.
No. So on a handle, you'll have one side with a positive Gaussian curvature and the other side negative. Is there a correlation between the Gaussian curvature and where the boujums, the charge of the boujums that sit there?
Yeah, but there are some correlations, but it's more than a simple, picture you would expect if you would have, for example, a two-dimensional layer of nematic on top of it. So there is some interplay, but it's more complicated.
Okay, I think we have to move to the next presentation. Let's thank Ivan again.